Welcome back to The Heat. I'm John Terrett, filling in for Anand Naidu. We're talking about one of the most controversial organizations in the world, the CIA, and we continue now with our international panel. Before the break, Carlos was telling us what it was like to be in Cuba with so much attention focused on it by the CIA. And Ken Osgood, of course, it wasn't just Cuba, was it? It was the whole of the Latin American bloc as time went on. They were in Nicaragua, Chile, El Salvador, pretty much you name it.
Well, that's true. The CIA operated around the world and throughout Latin America. Obviously, two of its most sort of famous campaigns of regime change were both in Latin America. You had the overthrow of the government of Guatemala in 1954, and you have the overthrow of the government in Chile in the 1970s. One thing to kind of keep in mind is that we're having this conversation about the CIA as if it's an agency that's acting on its own volition, or it's sort of a rogue elephant, as the phrase went in the 1970s. But so far as we can tell from the historical record, and there are places where there are blanks and things of that nature, but as far as we can tell from the overthrow, from the historical record, the CIA generally operated under the parameters established by the U.S. policymaking apparatus, the President and the National Security Council. So when we're thinking about the CIA, we also have to think about it, or sort of understand it as one sort of outgrowth of American foreign policy writ large.
Well, Ken, you bring us on to a very, very good point, because, and here I'll come to you, Ray, President Truman formed it in 1947, and almost all of the presidents have had issues with the CIA down the line. For example, Truman himself was warned, as you touched on earlier, that it could get away from him. It could get out of his control. And we'll come to that again in just a second. LBJ was told that America was totally ill-suited for guerrilla warfare in Vietnam. And he was very irked by that. Reagan, of course, suffered Iran-Contra, though in the end, he managed to survive it. I mean, what do you think about this issue of whether or not the CIA is working on behalf of the administration or working covertly behind the scenes for what it sees as its own ends?
Well, John, I hate to be this way, but it's both and. Now, Ken is quite right in talking about the historical perspective, but even there, if you go back to the Bay of Pigs, you had a rogue CIA there. Kennedy told them, look, I don't think much of your operational plan, but if you get bogged down on that beach, do not expect any U.S. armed forces to support you. We know from Allen Dulles' coffee-stained notes that he said, once we get on the beach, we will come under fire. There'll be no president that can be reluctant to bail us out at that point. Kennedy said after that we should destroy the CIA, scattered it in 1,000 pieces.
Yes.
And a few months later, you know what happened to Kennedy.
Right.
Am I suggesting there's a link there? I'm suggesting that CIA files from that period should be released. There are a lot of very, very good books that go into that, one of which is done by James Douglas. I suggest everyone read JFK and the Unspeakable.
What about the link between the CIA and WMDs in Iraq? Now, I know that you are very critical of the Bush administration going to war based on evidence presented by the CIA, and of course it ending up costing thousands, if not millions, of lives.
Yeah, this was out-and-out fraud, John. Not many people realize this. This was no mistake. What really pained us alumni, okay, was our former colleagues participated in a fraud on the American people and the Iraqi people, responsible for chaos in the Middle East right now. In other words, that evidence, that intelligence on WMD and on purported links between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda were manufactured, were made up, were forged, okay? Now, what's the outcome of that? You see what the outcome of that. You can see what happens to our division, all right, the analysis division, if they bow, as George Tenet did, saying it's a slam dunk to satisfy a president and want to go to war. Now, the good news is that there are enough honest analysts in the CIA to have risen up and prevented Bush and Cheney from attacking Iran. I can prove it. You can look in Bush's memoirs. There was an estimate which said Iran stopped working on nuclear weapon at the end of 2003. I'll say it again. stopped working on a nuclear weapon at the end of 2003. And we know that Bush in his memoir said that took our plans out of, this was a bombshell. How could I justify attacking a country that the intelligence community says has no active nuclear weapons program? Bummer. I mean, he should have called up for the Israelis. Hey, guess what? This is good news. They stopped 3 years ago, 4 years ago. Oh, man. But, that was what their plan was. So what I'm saying here is that if you have enough honest analysts with a good manager, in this case was Tom Finger, who is imported from state intelligence, did a bang-up job. This is the only estimate that I can describe usefully as having played a singular role in stopping a very, very bad war. War with Iran would have made war with Iraq look like a volleyball game between two high school.
Well, let's bring in Mohammad Marandi in Beirut, but of course a professor from the University of Tehran. How does that make you feel when you hear Ray here, who spent 27 years working with this organization, talking about there being 2 of them? There are the analysts who stopped a war with Iran, apparently, we are told now, and a greater rogue element. How does that make you feel, sitting there in the Middle East right now?
Well, the United States has not only caused suffering for tens of millions of people in this part of the world, they've caused suffering for Americans themselves. The coup in Chile in 1973, I think it was on September the 11th, and that's the same date where the 2001 attacks on New York and D.C. were carried out, which was blowback from U.S. involvement in Afghanistan and the CIA supporting extremists along with the Saudis, the Wahhabi extremists in Afghanistan. So there is this very strong relationship between U.S. involvement outside of the country, the dirty wars and the dirty involvement of the CIA, and the problems that the United States faces at home.
Okay.
The same is true with Europe. European allies who always go alongside the United States in its involvement in the region, they allowed the CIA to help to destroy Syria, right where, very close to where I am. Bomb attacks were carried out in this very city by ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliated groups, and the United States had no problem with it. Only later on, when you had millions of refugees streaming into Europe and then bomb attacks in European capitals, did they started to rethink the policies that they were pursuing through intelligence organizations to destabilize Syria, a policy which killed hundreds of thousands of Syrians.
Okay, Mohammed, thank you. Ken Osgood in Denver. It is true that American presidents criticize the CIA, but almost all of them go along with what it recommends. Is it too simplistic a question to ask you why they do covert operations?
Why comes down to, first of all, international security concerns, the potential threats to U.S. interests abroad, and that includes throughout the Cold War the perception of a great Soviet menace, whether exaggerated or not. The second factor would include economic factors. So are U.S. interests in jeopardy or in danger, economic interests? And we know that in several key cases, economic interests played a vital role in determining or shaping U.S. intervention policies. And the third broader category is domestic politics. Presidents are political animals, and they're concerned about their political fortunes and the political fortunes of their party. And so we know also that those kind of political considerations affected their thinking. The most obvious example would be the Kennedys in Cuba, very concerned about being called appeasers and letting Cuba go the way of the communists.
Okay. Very quickly, Ray, very quick.
I would simply say, in addition to oil and empire.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the history since the last war, Mossadegh, for example, he decided he wanted to have the Iranian people profit a little bit more from what the British considered to be their oil. Okay. And the British took us under the arm and said, well, this is what you do in such cases. And so that was oil, and empire is part of the game here.
Okay, well, bear in mind that word empire as we come to probably, I think, our final question, and that is that President Trump has begun rowing back President Obama's reforms regarding Cuba, and he's talking very, very tough against Iran. And indeed, he's appointed somebody to be a senior official to deal only with Iran, reporting directly to the administration. Carlos Alzugaray, do you fear going forward, bearing in mind what you said earlier, that there will now be, under President Trump, a renewed focus on your island?
Well, I think you have to understand that the measures taken by President Obama, which were not that big, I mean, they were big in a certain sense, but actually the main weapon or the main instrument that the U.S. has used recently against Cuba has been the economic sanctions, and they're still there. And maybe Obama wanted to change them, but he couldn't. But so let's take that into account. Obama made important changes. I am not diminishing the historical importance of what he did, but remember this, he was basically saying this policy has not worked, we should change the policy. As a matter of fact, when he spoke in December 17, 2014, he said, we're changing the policy, but not the purpose of the policy. Now, the purpose of the policy, obviously, is regime change in Cuba. So I would say that what he was proposing and what he implemented was kind of a soft engagement policy to produce in Cuba that regime change. Now, so to take into account that, President Trump has announced with a big bang a reversal of those policies. But, you know, his record on Cuba is that he even sent people to Cuba in violation of the economic sanctions. So I look at what President Trump did on June 16 more bark than bite. He was announcing big time a big change in Cuba policy to please the so-called Cuban-American constituents. There is a basic mistake there because the Cuban-American constituency has changed a lot, and now a majority of Cuban-Americans support a different policy towards Cuba.
Okay.
So, yes, I am concerned because of the rhetoric of Trump takes the relationship back to the old days of the Cold War, but at the same time, he left many things untouched, like, for example, diplomatic relations, the agreements. There is a significant security cooperation between Cuba and the United States that has not been reversed because it is in the interest of the United States. So I would frame it in that context.
Carlos, thank you. Mohammed, finally, and briefly, if you would, it's the same situation with Iran, isn't it? That President Trump is talking tough, and yet there is that nuclear deal in place. It's not been rowed back from. But do you think there will be renewed interest from the CIA in particular in Iran, or do you think that that's never gone away, really?
Well, first of all, I don't want to underestimate the amount of evil that the United States can do. It is the most responsible out of all countries in the world for the creation of both ISIS and Al-Qaeda. But having said that, I think that the United States has so many problems at home and abroad after especially Trump coming to power and the divisions with Congress and the Senate and the political establishment that it will be very difficult for Trump to really do a great deal. We'll have to see, but I think that the United States is going to face very troubling times ahead.
Ray, Mohammed, Carlos, and Ken, thank you all very much indeed for a most interesting discussion. Thank you. Most grateful. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. It's been my pleasure sitting in for Anand Naidu. I'm John Terrett in Washington. Thanks for being with us.